Clause 2J, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman will state his point of order.
Clause 2J, 2C of Rule 11 permits up to 1 hour of questioning by staff of this committee. This gentleman is a private consultant.
You're talking too fast. I can't understand you. I'm sorry.
This gentleman is a private consultant whose very consultant contract explicitly states that he is not an employee of this committee, not a government employee. Congressional handbook states in explicit terms, consultants contracted to work for standing committees, 2 U.S.C. 4301, are explicitly not employees of the committee. House Admin Committee will not even approve a contract for a consultant that will be performing regular or normal duties of committee staff. Any attempt to suggest that someone can simultaneously be an employee of the committee and not be an employee of the committee and committee staff defies even the most attenuated logic. The majority's use of private sector consultants to question witnesses constitutes an egregious violation of House rules under any circumstances. Under the circumstances of the current so-called impeachment inquiry, it would constitute an unprecedented privatization of impeachment. I have the employment contract here of the gentleman, Mr. Barry Burke, and also have the letter in which you are asking a question. Also have the staff role, which he is not listed as a staff member. He is a private consultant. Point of order is he should not be able to allow questioning of this witness. I have no problem because you have already run through and bullied through last week a staff questioning. If you have fine staff, if your staff asks questions, I will withdraw the point of order, but Mr. Burke or Mr. Norman is neither one allowed to ask questions under this rule. And Ms. Lofgren's committee is here, and we do have committee staff from House Admin who agrees with this interpretation.
I am prepared to rule on the point of order. For the purposes of staff questioning under the resolution adopted by the committee on September 12, 2019, there is no distinction between staff and consultants. First, the chair has significant discretion to determine who qualifies as staff for the purposes of the resolution. Committee consultants, in effect, function as staff for all intents and purposes. They are paid out of the committee's budget, they work at the chairman's discretion, and they are subject to all the same ethical and legal responsibilities as any other House employee. Second, the committee's retention of consultants is consistent with prior committee practice. Committee consultants have been retained to question witnesses at hearings and other proceedings, and they've assisted with significant investigations, including impeachment investigations. For example, David Shippers, the consultant to the majority, and Abby Lowell to the minority during the Clinton impeachment investigation. Committee consultants have questioned witnesses without objection from members. In fact, just last Congress, the Republican majority of this committee hired consultants to assist with their investigation into former Secretary of State Clinton's emails, and they regularly asked questions during transcribed interviews and other matters connected with that investigation. Our consultants were retained specifically to assist the committee perform its oversight and investigative functions, which is the purpose of today's hearing. Accordingly, I overrule the point of order.
Mr. Chairman, let's continue this for a second because this is an important part.
Do you wish to appeal the ruling of the chair?
Mr. Chairman.
What?
Mr.
I'm sorry, you can be heard on the point of order.
Thank you. Because, Mr. Chairman, you're going down a very interesting road here, and this is an interesting road that we've already discussed, and undoubtedly you had a very big misunderstanding of just a few minutes ago. We are not in an impeachment inquiry. We're not. You may want it to be, you may think it is, and if you want to go to the floor right now, I'm sure they'll clear floor time for us and you can bring your privilege resolution for an impeachment inquiry. You can, but you don't have the votes. But you can't just make it up on the fly. And the chairwoman of the administration committee is here, that we have talked to our committee staff on that part. They would not ever agree that a contract employee is a staff member. The folks that you just named were after an impeachment inquiry was formed. They were hired for that specific purpose. Now, if you want to continue this, this is a violation of the House rule. This is a privilege resolution for the House rules. We've already had today the problematic issue of overstepping time. But this one, Mr. Chairman, is one that cannot go forward. This is one that you have great staff members. They are legally staffed. They fit every definition, and no contract approved by the House Admin Committee, including the chairman who is on this committee, can actually contract services to be provided by a consultant that are regular, normal business of a committee staff. This is regular, normal committee oversight if you want to have it. Even how you dress it up, it doesn't matter. This is not anything different. And to continue down this path puts your entire line already in question by millions of people, but a questioning committee to this House puts us in jeopardy because if it's win at all costs, Mr. Chairman, then we've got a problem.
Mr. Chairman.
If it's win at all costs, we've got a problem.
Mr. Chairman, I just have a question for the chair.
Who's 60?
I just have a question.
No, questions are not in order. We're discussing a point of order.
I have a question on the point of order.
Then you're recognized.
If they're staff, why were they called consultants in their employment contract?
That's not a point of order.
Well,
Mr.
then
I will-
let me
I
ask,
will- I am
Mr.
prepared-
Chairman, let me ask about this. Did the rule change last week, 1 week ago today, that we voted on, that you voted for, we voted against, did it mention the word consultants in the rule changes that were adopted by the committee?
I can't hear what he's saying, because you're talking.
Chairman, regular order.
Yes, I cannot hear what Mr. Jordan is saying because Mr. Collins is talking too.
The resolution that the majority adopted last week, was the word consultant mentioned in there when it came relative to the ability of staff to ask questions?
It was not.
It was not. So, let me get this straight. You changed the rules last week, and now this week you're not going to follow the rules you changed.
We are, all right. I am going to rule on the point of...
Mr. Chairman.
may I speak
No,
to
I'm
the point
going
of
to
order?
rule on the point of order.
I'd like to speak toward
You can't,
the point of order.
it is not in order to have a debate on a point of order. The gentleman made his point of order.
They're not an employee of the committee, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman, you've made that point, that's your point of order. I am prepared to rule on it.
But may I be
Number
heard on
one-
a point of personal privilege?
Gentlelady.
Since my name has been invoked, I have ascertained that in fact the staff director for the House Administration Committee has not been solicited for his information.
Did not ask your staff director, ask ours.
Okay.
Fine.
Now,
Because you're at this
I
point,
yield back, Mr.
because we
Chair.
go back, the issue here, though, is
the
though...
issue here was stated already by you. You don't have to repeat it.
No,
We
this is
you've
be
made your-
careful going down this road,
made
Mr.
your
Chairman.
point, and I'm going to rule on it.
Be careful, Mr. Chairman.
I'm going to be very careful.
The
Number
steamroller...
one, we are in an impeachment investigation, but that is, whether or not we are, is not relevant to this question. So we're not going to debate whether...
Yes,
that
it is.
now. It is not relevant to that question.
But now
We
you
can
just
hi-
changed from investigation to
we-
inquiry. I mean, which
It
is it?
not, that is not relevant to this question. The committee's retention of consultants is consistent with prior committee practice. Consultants have been retained to question witnesses at hearings and at other proceedings, not only in impeachment hearings. This is consistent with past practice. I so rule, I overrule the point of order.
Mr. Chairman,
The
parliamentary
point of order is overruled.
parliamentary.
And unless someone wants to ask for a vote on the point of order,
Now, Mr. Chairman.
do you wish to ask, do you wish to
Yes.
vote on?
No, I want to talk. I want to ask you a question here. Because...
No, the
there's
point
no-
of order.
Regular order, Mr. Chairman.
The point of order, you raised a point of, you were recognized for the purpose of raising a
Call
point
the
of order.
question.
You raised it, I ruled on it. Do you wish to appeal the ruling of the chair, yes or no?
Yes.
If
I move to
ruling
table,
of
Mr.
the cha-
Chairman.
What?
I move to table the appeal of the
This
ruling.
is a
ruling of the
sad
chair
day.
is over, the
This is a sad day for this committee.
ruling of the chair is appealed. The gentlelady moves to table the appeal of the ruling of the chair. The clerk will call the roll. The clerk will call the roll on the question of approving the motion to table the appeal of the ruling of the chair.
Can you get all that? Mr. Nadler?
Aye.
Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren?
Yes.
Ms. Lofgren votes yes. Ms. Jackson Lee?
Aye.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson of Georgia? Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Deutsch? Mr. Deutsch votes aye. Ms. Bass? Mr. Richmond? Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Cicilline? Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu? Mr. Liu votes aye. Mr. Raskin? Mr. Raskin votes aye. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Demings? Ms. Demings votes aye. Mr. Correa? Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Scanlon?
Aye.
Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Ms. Garcia?
Aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Mr. Neguse? Mr. Neguse votes aye. Ms. McBath? Mr. Stanton? Mr. Stanton votes aye. Ms. Dean?
Aye.
Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. McCarcel Powell? Ms. Mucarsel Powell votes aye. Ms. Escobar?
Aye.
Ms. Escobar votes aye. Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins votes no. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Gomert? Mr. Jordan? No. Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Buck? Mr. Ratcliffe? Ms. Roby? Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes no. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana?
No.
Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes no. Ms. Lesko? Mr. Reschenthaler? Mr. Klein?
No.
Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Armstrong? Mr. Armstrong votes no. Mr. Stube? Mr. Cohen votes aye.
Has everyone voted who wishes to vote? We okay? The clerk will report. No, wait. We're still waiting for someone.
Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman?
Who seeks? No. We're in the middle of the vote.
Oh, I haven't called the roll? Okay.
The gentleman from Arizona? Has the gentleman from Arizona been recorded?
Mr. Stanton, you voted aye.
Are we waiting for anybody else yet? Okay, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 19 ayes and 8 noes.
The point of order, the motion to table the appeal of the ruling of the chair is agreed to. The majority has designated Barry Burke to conduct its questioning. Mr. Burke, you are now recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I have a parliamentary inquiry before Mr. Burke begins.
I had one too.
The gentleman will state his parliamentary inquiry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, you mentioned earlier that there were consultants who had been used to question witnesses, and so I'm just going to ask as a parliamentary inquiry, what were the parliamentary occurrences where a consultant...
Point of order, Mr. Chairman, that's
committee-
not a parliamentary inquiry.
The gentleman is correct. That is not a parliamentary inquiry.
Very well, I have a point of order.
Who else has a parliamentary inquiry? Mr. Jordan.
Mr. Chairman, was today's witness, Mr. Lewandowski, when he was subpoenaed, was he notified that
That is not a
consultants would be
parliamentary
questioning him?
That is not a parliamentary inquiry either.
That's a
Mr. Burke-
procedural,
Mr.
important
Burke is
procedural
recogni-
question.
Mr. Burke
Mr.
is...
Chairman, Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Burke is recognized for 30 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I move to adjourn.
The motion to adjourn is in order and is not debatable. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler?
What? No.
Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson-Lee? Ms. Jackson-Lee votes no. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Johnson of Georgia? Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Deutsch? Mr. Deutsch votes no. Ms. Bass? Mr. Richmond? Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Cicilline?
No.
Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu? Mr. Liu votes no. Mr. Raskin? Mr. Raskin votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Demings? Ms. Demings votes no. Mr. Correa? Mr. Correa votes no. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon votes no. Ms. Garcia?
No.
Ms. Garcia votes no. Mr. Neguse? Mr. Neguse votes no. Ms. McBath? Ms. McBath votes no. Mr. Stanton? No. Mr. Stanton votes no. Ms. Dean?
No.
Ms. Dean votes no. Ms. Mucarsel Powell?
No.
Ms. Mucarsel-Powell votes no. Ms. Escobar?
No.
Ms. Escobar votes no. Mr. Collins?
To adjourn.
Motion to adjourn. Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Gomert? Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Buck? Mr. Ratcliffe? Ms. Roby? Mr. Gates? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes yes. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes aye. Ms. Lesko? Mr. Reschenthaler? Mr. Klein?
Aye.
Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Armstrong? Mr. Armstrong votes yes. Mr. Stubbe? Mr. Gates, you are not recorded. Mr. Gates votes aye.
The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 8 ayes and 20 noes.
The motion to adjourn is not agreed to. Mr. Burke is recognized for 30 minutes.
First, point of parliamentary inquiry.
Who has a point of parliamentary inquiry? The gentleman will state his point of parliamentary.
My parliamentary
The gentleman
inquiry.
will state his point of parliamentary inquiry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My inquiry is this. It relates to the rule that we changed last week, where we mentioned staff would conduct the questioning, and it's been expanded to include consultants today. My question is, did we contemplate that the distinction between independent contractors such as a consultant?
Sorry, I couldn't hear you. Did we contemplate what?
Did we contemplate independent contractors such as a consultant would be vis-a-vis employees, which is what the staff would be, as being part of the distinction when that rule was changed last week?
The gentlelady from...
Point of order, Mr.
Mr.
Chairman.
Chairman, the advice I've received from the top staff person at the House Administration Committee is that staff can be comprised of employees, interns, detailees, fellows, contractors, etc. Staff and employee are not equivalent terms. And I yield back.
So would the gentlelady yield to a question?
Certainly.
So my question would be, is the Committee on House Administration, it's indicated to me anyway, that will not approve a contract if the services to be provided by the consultant are the regular and normal duties of committee staff? Are you saying that this, I mean, I was under the impression that this was not extraordinary.
That's not pertinent to this proceeding. I'd happy after the meeting to go through, but this was signed off by the committee itself. It met all of our
The
requirements.
gentleman has not stated a parliamentary inquiry. The time is Mr. Burke's. The gentleman, Mr. Burke has 30 minutes. Is recognized for 30 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, as you know, I'm counsel for Mr. Lewandowski. I need about 30 seconds to
You will
register
not
a
get
formal
30
protest, Mr.
You are not a witness, and you should not be seated at that table.
I understand that, and I'm going to
In
leave as soon as I
courtesy-
can register
in
this formal
courtesy-
protest based upon the debate that I've just heard. These seem to be unauthorized questions, and I
You
know...
have- the
And I know you choose your words carefully, and I will leave it to Mr. Lewandowski to decide, but it is my view that he should not answer
Point of order,
unauthorized
Mr. Chairman. We're
questions.
not interested
Thank
in
you.
your view, sir. We have a hearing to conduct.
The gentleman's point is
That's
well
his
taken.
legal counsel,
We are
Mr.
having a
Cicilline.
hearing to conduct.
Point of order, I don't believe Mr. Cicilline stated a rule
Mr.
in reference to this
Lewandowski
point of order.
will answer all questions. If he has a legitimate privilege to assert, he may, of course, assert the legitimate privilege. Other than that, he is under subpoena. He will answer all questions. This is being done pursuant to the committee's rules, and if his counsel doesn't like it, you don't interpret our rules, with all due respect.
Right, and these were, what my
Burke
point is,
is-
Mr. Chairman, these are
Mr. Burke is
unauthorized
recognized-
questions.
Mr. Burke is
Thank you.
recognized for 30 minutes.
Mr. Lewandowski, did you ever be